Hello, students. It's April 9th, 2020, and we're going to cover chapters 1, 2, and 3 in Ben Crump's The Legalized Genocide of Colored People open season. And so the topics for chapter 1, Racism Kills. Chapter 2, Please Don't Shoot White Men in the Back. And chapter 3, Stand Your Ground. So in chapter 1, he talks about how he'd taken a class with Professor Jones, and they were talking about the definition of racism. And the class, let's see, it was Theory and Dynamics of Racism and Oppression at Florida State University. He references, they talked about Harriet Tubman, why she did what she did, and she said she couldn't justify being free while others were enslaved. And that's on page 21. And he goes over Dr. Jones' definition of racism is the assertion of superiority in order to discriminate. And he also talks about how what they did as far as when they brought Africans over, like they used Christianity to manipulate them and said, if you become Christian, you can be free. And then they were like, oh, that's not going to work because they wanted to have slaves. And so then they got into the colorism, and they said, so by making color the key factor behind enslavement, dark-skinned people brought from Africa to work in silver mines and on sugar plantations could be exploited for life. And then that was on page 22. 23 talks about, we almost expect to find better equipped schools, hospitals, and business located in white neighborhoods. And although race itself is not real, racism affects every aspect of Black lives, from the type of medical care they can expect to how they are treated from banks, from the quality of the education of their children to their prospects for jobs and how they are treated on job interviews, from the percentage of the raise they get to their opportunities for promotion. It even plays a role when they travel by car or plane. And so, we're seeing right now with this coronavirus, some specific situations, where there's reports about how this coronavirus, although anybody can get it, it's disproportionately affecting Black folks because of health issues, because we're not receiving access to the quality health care, even though we're one of the wealthiest nations in the world. And as far as education, you got this, I do educational advocacy, and, I get calls all the time from parents that are talking about the substandard quality of education that their children are receiving, and things of that nature. So that's on page 24. He also talks about the police, how, they talk about how many people think of racism only in individual terms rather than as a system of oppression. For example, when confronted by the now almost daily media reports of nationwide racist police behavior, these people will often reduce these officers to a few bad apples who need to be removed. They do not see these racist behaviors as being systematic, institutional, and integral to maintaining the system of white supremacy. And he talks about reports from the FBI where they said that there are white supremacist groups that have infiltrated some of the police departments. And again, I will say this because, again, as I said, the kids have said to me, police officers, those of you who are police officers out there, now if you see people out there, some of your peeps acting inappropriately, it's on you to report them as well. I mean, obviously it's on all of us if we see inappropriate behavior. I know most police are good, but when you see a bad apple, you need to shout it from the rooftops, because if they're out there mistreating folks, it can come back on you, 25, he talks about the research of the sociologist Joe Fagan, who concluded that the United States was founded as a racist society and that racism remains at the core of the American experience. He also references on 26, sociologist Nikki Lisa Cole writes, rooted in a racist foundation, systematic racism today is composed of intersecting, overlapping, and codependent racist institutions, policies, practices, ideas, and behaviors that give an unjust amount of resources, rights, and power to white people while denying the same resources, rights, and power to people of color. Because, typically you'd be watching things like, you see, they talk about what's happening in Africa and children starving in Africa. And then, but you come here in America, I've seen it. I've worked in some of the inner cities. You know, most recently I've had the experience of working in Detroit, and there's third world conditions in Detroit. I've been in homes working as a lawyer garden ad litem and seeing, you know, how they substandard conditions, not people not having basic necessities, running water, you know, even the issue about having clean water. If you look at what happened with Flint in Michigan, and, you know, as I said, substandard health care. And it's to me, it's abomination, because we built this country, but we're getting some substandard services, and it's unjust. It's not right. It needs to be fixed. So 26, he also talks about institutional racism makes individuals racist by default as they participate and believe in these institutions. It has been individuals who've enslaved, abused, lynched, raped, and falsely incarcerated Black and brown people. These individual efforts turned into powerful collective endeavors when backed by political, legal, and social systems. What impact does this daily assault have on the victims, the poor and racialized people? It is death, and there are many ways to die. And then, let's see. You know, he also talks about, you die when you witness this is on page 27, you die when you witness your father murdered by the police as you sit on swings in the playground of your apartment complex. His crime being Black in the wrong place at the wrong time. You die a little more when your distraught mother falls apart and struggles to support you after his death, but has little access to quality food or medical care, affordable child care, or decent paying job. You die when they charge you with rape and imprison you, although you're innocent and still a child. You know, if you look at Just Mercy, you can look at that. And I mean, look at what the work of Brian Stevenson has done, where you have children that have been locked up for life in prison, and he was able to get the Supreme Court to you know, reverse that policy, but you still have conservative prosecutors who don't want to let go. They don't want to let go of this systematic racist ideology and understand that people have circumstances that cause them to do certain things. And as you know, as I said too, there are people that are innocent. Watch Just Mercy. Watch it on Amazon. Okay, death is living in the terror of law enforcement officers who should protect you, but instead harass you at every turn. And so when he also talks about white folks having better resources in their neighborhoods, like, because, you know, my parents, my mother comes from the south side of Chicago. My dad comes from Benton Harbor, Michigan. And I had asked my mom, you know, why did she decide to be in Ann Arbor as opposed to being in Chicago or being in Detroit, being in the inner city? And she said, I'm going to go where the white people go, because typically where the white people go, they have better resources. And that's just, it's a fact. That's typically reality in America. But if there's a few, you know, you look at it, if there's a few Black people coming to the neighborhood, white folk don't get upset. But then you have a whole group of Black folk, then yeah, they start getting scared. They're brainwashed by some of the images on TV, media, radio, things like that. So he says on 28, isolation and loneliness as a minority among the majority is a form of death. These are all slow deaths, soft deaths, the worst kind. Racism is a tool in genocide. Black people are being criminalized and murdered based on their race, and this is sanctioned by the state. He also, and this is on 28, he says, and as I mentioned earlier, Blacks haven't been the only group who've brutally suffered under the weight of racism and white supremacy. Killing of Native Americans is so American that Frank L. Bloom, the author of the beloved children's classic, The Wizard of Oz, even put out a full-page editorial advocating for the eradication of Native Americans. Okay, that is messed up. That is white supremacy. He also talks about on 29, the state also forcibly removed Native children from their families in a move to civilize them. This was a common practice in white settler nations and is responsible for much intergenerational trauma, which still reverberates today as we see children being separated from their parents at U.S. borders. On page 30, he talks about how it says, from that time to the present, when the powers that be thought it advantageous or necessary to subjugate people of color in order to achieve some objective or perceived benefit, then it has always been open season on the rights of people of color. Racism exists. It is systematic, institutional, and ingrained. It has permeated the society as a whole. Those who deny it, it could possibly indirectly be its greatest supporters because it leads to the current state of unchecked racism. Racism unchecked, as we've seen with the Native American population, Jewish Europeans, and other racialized communities, leads to genocide. So that's chapter 1, racism kills. Chapter 2, police don't shoot white men in the back. So he was talking about how he goes around and he talks, this has been Attorney Ben Crump, goes around and talks to groups, black folk, and, you know, ask about black folks that have been killed, and they can go through the whole litany, the list of black people that have been killed, shot by the police, and then they'll ask about white people that have been killed by the police, and they're just not able to recount that as easily. And then, so the list of the black folks will come up. He said they will very quickly give me more than 5 names of black people killed by the police that are now referenced as hashtag. Michael Brown, Laquan McDonald, that's the brother that was in Chicago. Walter Scott, that's the brother that was shot in the back down south. That was South Carolina. Terrence Crutcher, John Crawford, Corey Jones, Oscar Grant, David Jones, Stephen Clark, Daniel Hembrook, and Anton Rose. So he goes over, he references a scenario of Edsel Ford, August 2014, a 25-year-old black man suffering from depression, bipolar disorder, and schizophrenia, detained by Los Angeles police as part of an investigation. Talks about how they knew he had mental health issues, and yet they said that he made suspicious movements and whirled around, and that he tried to come after one of the officers, and they basically shot him in the back and killed him. And that the police department investigators concluded that the officers, Wampler and Villegas, acted reasonably and that their actions were justified. It's just no different than you had a case here in Ann Arbor. You had Ora Rosser, mentally ill, boyfriend calls the police, said she pulled a fish knife. They said they were aware that she had mental health issues, shot her in the head and killed her, deemed it a justifiable homicide. And everybody knows if she had been a white woman, middle class or upper class white woman, they would not have treated that case the same way. So we are in an apartheid system. There's racism, classism, oppression, and America needs to heal. We need to heal from this coronavirus, but we need to be healed from the isms, from the racism, classism, sexism, the isms that confront our society. He also talked about on page 33, I represented Terrence Crutcher from Tulsa in a case I called Hands Up, Don't Shoot on Video. Talks about how Mr. Crutcher had car trouble and how Officer Shelby came up on him and he had his hands up and shot him, killed him. And they had a helicopter above, and this is on page 34. They said that looks like a bad dude. Yeah, there's no indication of why the officer was saying that, other than the fact it's a black man, and a black man in America, you look like a black dude, a bad dude, because that's a socialization, it's a brainwashing. It says the footage released by the Tulsa Police Department indicates that there was no reasonable fear that could justify killing Crutcher. If anyone had a right to be afraid, it was him. And then the officer goes to trial, found not guilty. She's on a speaking tour. She's lauded for her racism and for her basically taking a brother out, committing genocide. Then he talks about in 35, Clementa C. Pickney, and what happened at the Mother Emanuel Church. Talks about the history of the church and its impact on the black community, and talks about Dylan Roof and what he had said to one of the victims. Says Twanza Sanders, this is on page 36, asked why he did what he did. The shooter replied, "I have to. You're raping our women and you're taking over the nation." And again, this is like some racist psychology, birth of the nation. It's like you've got this paranoia that's been inbred into some white people, institutionalized into the system of this fear, brainwashing. And it talks about Dylan Roof, what he did, went in the church, and how, he killed these innocent black people, one of which was Clementa C. Pickney, a man who, in response to the police shooting in the back of unarmed Walter Scott on April 4th, 2015, helped guide through the state legislature a bill requiring officers to wear body cameras. No, he recounts how the disparity in treatment, you know, you see it all the time. Like you have, when we do stuff, we have a, you know, when we do stuff, we're called in the media, they call us animals, like savages, things like that. But when other white folks do it, they had a mental breakdown. And they, in this situation here with Dylan Roof, they took him to Burger King. Timothy McVeigh too, you know, there's this disparate treatment when it's a white person, a you know, so-called white terrorist versus a black person that commits a crime, things like that. He talks about Tamir Rice. That's a situation where the caller said, I don't think it's a real gun, and I think it's a juvenile, but they still went in there, and he recounts what was said by the Young Turks, how it says, look, there are, like looking at doing a comparison of the Dylan Roof situation and Tamir Rice, and it says, look, there are a lot of different reasons why that might have happened, that Roof was not immediately apprehended. I don't know all the details of the police reaction at the moment to that crime. Nobody's asking for the police to go shoot people at sight. What we're asking for is the opposite. So when you see a 12-year-old boy like Tamir Rice, don't shoot him in 2 seconds flat. Maybe he's got a toy gun. Maybe he didn't mean any harm. Maybe he's 12 years old, 12-year-old boy in the park. So we can afford everyone some degree of latitude. If we're going to afford it to a terrorist like this guy, meaning Dylan Roof, then we can afford it to a 12-year-old boys. You know, he's talking also too about how they're in Ohio, and technically, if they thought that Tamir Rice was an adult with a gun, then he would have the right to stand your ground. And, you know, and if he had been white, they would have dealt with things differently. So on page 44, he says, remember, no moral society will accept horrific killings of innocent people unless it's somehow justified as rational. This is why the powers that be constantly portray minorities as uncivilized, dangerous savages who are not deserving of the equal respect and consideration that law enforcement officers must extend to white citizens. And this is regardless of any constitutional rights. I mean, students, you know, we've been studying this. We've been looking at the history of this country from 1619 to the Constitution, how blacks were considered 3/5 of a human, Civil War, Emancipation Proclamation, Reconstruction, 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, then Black Codes, Jim Crow, Civil Rights. It's been a roller coaster experience for black folks. He also talks about once the classic method of lynching was the rope. Now it's the policeman's bullet. To many an American, the police are the government. Certainly it is most visible representative. We submit that the evidence suggests that the killing of Negroes has become police policy in the United States, and that the police policy is the most practical expression of government policy. You should also check out Stephen Biko's movie, that movie they talk about Cry Freedom, because that, you know, and you look at South Africa, they talk about that you see there was a lot of oppression there of black folks, and because of white supremacy. And that what's crazy about South Africa is the black people are in the majority there, but you see what they did is they had tribalism, and they manipulated them with tribalism. It's just like what they talk about the Willie Lynch letter, which was a slave master, and basically said if you separate blacks based on their color, age, religion, you know, you can just go through, and if you separate them, then they'll do it to themselves. We do it to ourselves because we've been brainwashed too. We've all been affected by being in this apartheid racist system. So 45, it says, do white law enforcement officers target minority suspects? It says that they found that blacks are disproportionately killed by police officers nationwide, and that in actuality, non-white officers kill both black and Latino suspects at significantly higher rates than whites do. I know I read Paul Butler's book, Chokehold. He talked about that as well as, you know, you would think that, and we do say that we should have more lawyers of color, we should have more women lawyers, and if we have more of a critical mass, we can help change the culture. But, you know, as we talk, like our sheriff in Washtenaw County, Sheriff Clayton, it goes into the training. If they're not having the proper training on and implicit bias, like programming or deprogramming to stop the implicit bias, you're gonna experience racism from black folk, black and brown folk. I've experienced it myself. You know, I come from I was born and raised in the Ypsilanti, Ann Arbor area, but and I've experienced racism for white people, but I've also experienced some racism or prejudice from black folks in Detroit, you know, which is, it's a setting, it's messed up. It's a Willie Lynch effect. So bullying is wrong no matter who it is, regardless of race, color, gender, all of that. So it talks on 45 in his article, "The Science of White Cops Shoot Young Black Men," published by Mother Jones magazine. Chris Mooney writes that inaccurate categorizing, often exacerbated by media portrayal, leads to the perception of stereotypes and prejudices that comprise implicit bias. These stereotypes and prejudices are then attributed to inherent and immutable qualities or primers, Afrocentric features, dark skin or dreadlocks, for instance. So I'll say, for when I'm doing a trial, typically we'll have my client, most of my clients are black, but I'll have my client stand up and I'll say, you know, I'm sure you guys have watched the news, social media, things of that nature. We know we're inundated with a lot of negative images of black people, as far as that we're out there committing crime. And, you know, I'll say to you, see my client here, and I want to make sure you look at him, look at his features. And I try to just say, does anybody here have any biases based on his features, his complexion, things of that nature? Because I want to try to root it out. And they need to have that for the judges, for the jurors, for everybody, prosecutors, police officers, because that stuff is real. You know, they even show with white people who have ethnic features that they can be discriminated against, as opposed to somebody that might have more Eurocentric features. So its implicit biases have been found to be associated with language, and this is on page 46. Certain behaviors such as eye contact, blinking rates, and smiles. Studies have found, for example, that school teachers clearly telegraph prejudices, so much so that some researchers believe black and white children effectively receive different educations despite being in the same classrooms. I mean, and you also see too, like, you know, you have some kids that'll play around, some white kids that'll play around, and a white teacher might look at them and just tell them to knock it off. But when black kids do it, white people get scared, they feel threatened, and they just look at it. It's like they look at it differently. You know, there's some teachers that would, you know, some seasoned teachers, some teachers like what I had back in the day, they would just deal with it and they wouldn't be scared. 46, so it says, but we can learn something from even the first studies. Those who showed greater levels of implicit bias toward or stereotypes of black or gay people were more unfriendly toward them. On 47, it says, he goes over, the shooting of Kay Gurley stands as a tragic example of hidden bias. 28-year-old Gurley was visiting his girlfriend in the Lewis Pink housing projects in Brooklyn, considered to be the worst housing projects in New York City. And his officer comes up on him, and first instinct was to shoot and hit Gurley in the chest. And they said that, you know, he was indicted by a grand jury for the shooting death of Akai Gurley. He was charged with second-degree manslaughter, criminal negligent homicide, second-degree assault, reckless endangerment, and 2 counts of official misconduct. Ling turned himself in, and he was released later that day without having to post bond. Ling was given 5 years of probation and 800 hours of community service. It's not the absence of hard jail time that's the issue, but that the punishment always tends to be lenient in cases where a cop has murdered a black man, and much more stringent in cases where a black person has killed a white person. On page 48, it says, according to the U.S. Supreme Court, fear can exonerate cops, no matter how egregious or unreasonable their use of force. And then he even talked about how Newt Gingrich, who was a conservative, had acknowledged on CNN Facebook live stream, it's more dangerous to be black in America than white. He also gives a recount of in July of 2012, and this is on page 49, of officers responding to allegations that Alicia Thomas was abandoning her minor child by leaving them at a police station, and then talks about this officer O'Callahan, how that there was a video showing her raised foot and struck Thomas, whose body shook in response. It says, a few minutes later, Thomas' eyes closed and her head fell backward. According to the police report, O'Callahan tells Thomas that if you don't stop resisting, I'm going to punch you. This is followed by O'Callahan kicking her in the genitals. So basically, Miss Thomas died, and Miss Thomas had mental health issues, depression, and here she was trying to do the right thing. They say if you're having a breakdown, you can't take care of your child, drop him off. But then she ends up getting killed. It says she just knew she was having a crisis, and so I've had clients like that now that are having crises, and it says they drag her out of her house, and then they drag her down the stairs, and they restrain her. She says, "I can't breathe more than Eric Gardner," and then for all of that, she ends up dead, and it's unfortunate. He recounts on page 52, the 1989 Supreme Court decision in the case of Graham versus Connor established the standard to be used by judges and juries when weighing whether an officer's use of force was reasonable given what the officer knew at the moment. And it also says police killings are brutalizing black and brown people and do in fact amount to genocide. In essence, the United States Supreme Court gave the police avoid going to jail instructions anytime they kill a minority, and it is implicit, it is simply to say these words: I felt threatened or I feared for my safety. So they give them the code language to say, go out there, kill brown and black folk, say you were afraid, you get in front of a jury, and you get acquitted most of the time, and that's legalized genocide. So then now I'll move on to chapter 3, Stand Your Ground. It says, if Trayvon Martin was of age and armed, could he have stood his ground on the sidewalk? President Barack Obama. So on page 56, it says, stand your ground laws are shoot first legislation shielding the shooter under an expanded justification of self-defense. These laws essentially absolve private citizens of any responsibility for killing people they find suspicious. And as we see, a pattern emerges as to the color of those it protects and those it fails to protect, like the black octogenarian Singletary he had talked about earlier, that's the story where he recounted where this Mr. Singletary, basically the undercover cops are in his yard and he pulls out a gun and he gets shot and killed, and they get away with it. It's a double standard. So he talks about on 57, in 2012, George Zimmerman was on trial for murder of 17-year-old Trayvon Martin in Stanford. And then, he recounts, Attorney Crump talks about how he talked to Tracy Martin, Trayvon's father. He told me that Trayvon was walking home from a 7-Eleven unarmed, minding his own business, talking with a girl over the phone when the neighborhood watch volunteer chased him and shot him, basically hunting him down, just like they've been doing from day one for black folk. They hunted us down in Africa, brought us over here, then hunted us down, have been hunting us down from the time we got here up until the present. Lynching us using guns to take us out, saying they're scared of us. It said, you said, so Attorney Crump is talking to Trayvon Martin's father. He said, you said that your teenage son was unarmed. Yes, sir. All he had was a bag of Skittles and a can of iced tea. I asked again for clarity, and you said the neighborhood watch volunteers shot him. Yes, and he shot Trayvon in the heart. I told Tracy Martin that he didn't need me because they were going to arrest the shooter. As an officer of the court, I knew that they arrested people in our community with no evidence at all. And here you had the self-confessed killer with the proverbial smoking gun in his hand and a dead teenager on the ground. I assured Martin that they were going to arrest Zimmerman. He told me the police said nothing would happen to the killer of his son because of Florida's stand your ground law. Tracy Martin's statement held true. Zimmerman was not arrested after the shooting, and the public's reaction was swift. We've talked about this. We've read over Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream, letter from a Birmingham jail, and I've been to the mountaintop. Without us protesting, and we all have to figure out our way of protesting. Sometimes it's marching, protesting. Sometimes it's boycotting, like boycotting racist companies. Like you can look now with these corona situation. If you see some companies that are being racist, classist, or sexist, we need to boycott them. Okay? We all have to figure out our way of protesting, how we're going to fight the power. And then it said, Tracy Martin's statement held true. Zimmerman was not arrested after the shooting, and the public's reaction was swift. More than 3.5 million people signed a Change.org petition. I mean, right now we've got Change.org petitions dealing with people who are incarcerated, because there are people who are incarcerated. We had a man die here in Jackson, Michigan, from the coronavirus, and they said 90 inmates were infected. We've had the Wayne County Sheriff has reduced the jail population. I have a client that's in now that's having some mental health issues, and we're trying to help the family to get him the right support so we can get him out. And I'm explaining to the family, we know he's having mental health issues, but he needs to get out because it's like a death trap. The jail, the prison is a death trap. It says basketball superstar LeBron James and the entire Miami Heat tweeted, the team tweeted a picture of themselves wearing Trayvon-style hoodies printed with the words, "We are all Trayvon," which was retweeted more than 5 million times. Thousands of young people occupied New York Times Square for the Million Hoodie Rally. In a White House speech, President Obama said, "This could have been my son." Trayvon Martin's story was the #1 news story in the world in 2012. The most heartbreaking aspect of this modern day tragedy was that basically they had this lady, Olivia Bertalion, they let her bring in this evidence. She not even a witness in it. If she was a witness in the case, but she talked about how she had her house broken into. She lived in that complex, and it's like basically gave a jury justifiable reason for why justify what Zimmerman was doing, even though they had no indication that Trayvon Martin was doing anything. He was there with his father and his stepmom and everything, so justifiably there. And so 59, he talks about, this is disturbing because by allowing her testimony, which had no evidence, no relevance to the case at hand, the court suggested that what Trayvon Martin's 28-year-old killer had done, profiling, pursuing, and shooting an unarmed black 17-year-old, was some sort of noble act of heroism. According to juror B37, the testimony marked a turning point for some members of the jury because it showed Zimmerman's heart was in the right place, according to a post-verdict news report. So it was messed up. On July 13, 2013, Zimmerman was acquitted in the death of Trayvon Martin, an unarmed black teenager. Stand your ground requires leaving the interpretation of terms that, like anticipated and reasonable belief, to the discretion of the courts. And 61, it says, Texas A&M University study also found that when whites use the stand your ground defense against black attackers, they are more successful than when blacks use the defense against white attackers. He recounts on the bottom of 61, on December 22nd, 1984, Bernard Getz, a thin 37-year-old white man from Manhattan, boarded the number 2 train and sat down near 4 rowdy young black men. And it says 19-year-old Tony Canty, one of the young men, said, "Hi, how are you?" To Getz, another of the other 4, Barry Allen, also 19, then walked up to Getz and asked him for $5. At that point, a third man, 18-year-old James Ramseur, turned to Getz and indicated he had something in his pocket, as though it might have been a gun. Several other passengers were at the other end of the train and might not have been aware of what was happening. Getz asked, "What do you want?" "Give me $5, Allen repeated. At that point, Getz reached into his pocket as though he were retrieving his wallet. Instead of a wallet, he pulled out a .38 Smith & Wesson revolver. He then shot each of the 4 young men, seriously injuring them. And it says, he further goes on, he talks about he fired again, shooting cabbie at close range. A bullet hit his spinal cord and paralyzed him for life. None of the men had guns, although they had screwdrivers in their pockets. It says, claiming his actions were driven by a previous mugging in 1981 and by the high crime rate in New York City, Getz was labeled by some as a vigilante and a hero and earned the nickname Subway Vigilante. However, when Getz' interviews with the police became public, the truth was revealed. Getz later admitted that his fear was heightened because the 4 young men were black. In the criminal trial, 1987, Getz was acquitted by an all-white jury of attempted murder, but was later found guilty of illegal firearms possession, for which he served less than a year. He since then has famously been quoted as saying, "I would without any hesitation shoot a violent criminal again." And it also says here on 63, jurors in the New York State now are told to consider a defendant's background when determining if the defendant's actions were reasonable, including one's predisposition to fear blacks. The court literally ruled that race can be used as a factor in determining self-defense. So, you know, that's what he talks about, the disparity that goes on. He also later on recounts the experience of McDonald, who is black and experiencing homophobia, and defended did the self, you know, as a transgender black woman, so defended herself, but she didn't get the same result as some of these other folks, as Zimmerman and Getz. And so it was a matter of disparate treatment. So I have discussion and participation questions. What's genocide? What's Attorney Crump's vision of how our nation can be redeemed? So those are from the introduction, those videos. What is Dr. William Jones' definition of racism? And what was established by Graham versus Connor? And what is stand your ground law? So stay tuned for our next reading. I had a few more pages from the race law book, and then we're going to continue with Ben Crump's open season, the legalized genocide of colored people. So stay tuned for the next videos. Again, you know, today from the governor, there's been an extension of the stay home, stay safe measure through April 30th. It may be extended past that. So stay safe. Be blessed. You have my number. You have my email if you have any questions. And again, just try to stay safe. Practice social distancing. I know some people feel they're invincible, but they're not. So, you know, that's why I know a lot of people taking things to help boost their immunity, vitamin C, things of that nature. So let me know if you have any questions. Okay.